In one room stood 22 coffins. The lids were removed from them and laid separately. Otherwise, everything would not fit. Inside, almost everyone. A person who had not been disturbed for 2,000 years. The year has not reached the middle, and from the earth they have already extracted a city founded by Alexander the Great, a forest at the bottom of the North Sea, wooden tools older than our species, and plague where it had nowhere to come from. 12 stories. Iraq, Egypt, Mexico, Greece, Siberia, West Africa, and the bottom of the sea between Britain and the continent. The last of them answers a question that is more than 100 years old. Why the Neanderthals disappeared. The answer there is not about strength. You are on the Top Facts channel. I wish everyone a pleasant viewing. The discovery was made in the summer, and they only told about it in January. Half a year of silence is not an intrigue. It is the time that was needed to understand what exactly was taken out of the ground in West Norfolk. When they announced it, both the cable news network and the British Broadcasting Corporation wrote about it. From the earth emerged a hoard of the Iron Age. It is about 2,000 years old. Such hoards are found in English fields every year, and usually the news about them lives for one day. Here it was different. In the hoard lay an almost intact bronze carnix. The word says nothing to almost anyone, and that is the difficulty. Until you explain what this thing is, it is impossible to understand why archaeologists jumped up from this news. A carnix is a wind instrument of the Celtic Iron Age. It was made in the last centuries before our era and in the first centuries of ours. And it does not look like a familiar trumpet at all. The instrument was assembled in the shape of an animal, most often a boar or a serpent. The bell at the top is the open mouth of the beast. The player held the trumpet vertically and raised it above his head, above the crowd, above the battle line. The mouth looked up, and the sound went into the sky, over the heads. Antique authors who happened to hear this described the sound identically. Harsh, discordant, disturbing to the point of being unpleasant. This is exactly what was intended. Carnixes were raised above the Celtic formation before a battle to create a wall of noise and break the enemy's spirit even before the first strike. Julius Caesar and other Romans who fought with the Celts separately noted how their attacks sounded. Horns, shouts, battle howls. All this went ahead of the people themselves. This image etched into the Romans so much that they began to depict it themselves. The carnix is on Trajan's column in Rome, where Celtic and Dacian warriors hold the trumpets raised. It is on the undisturbed cauldron, a large silver ritual vessel found in Denmark, on which the most detailed depictions of Celtic ritual life have been preserved. Everyone knew the instrument, but the instruments themselves are not there. The main find before Norfolk was the Deskford carnix. It was found in Scotland in the year 1778, and only the head of the animal survived from it, without the pipe. And even this one detail is considered among the most important Celtic objects found in Britain. More carnix details, parts of bells and mounts, were taken from a hoard in Tentignac in France in the year 2004. But an almost intact specimen, from which the entire shape and the entire assembly can be seen, had never been found in Britain until this summer. In the same hoard lay a second thing, and it is no simpler: a metal standard with the head of a boar, a sign that was carried in front, in battle or at a ceremony, as an indication of who is coming. The boar meant very much in the Celtic world. It was depicted on helmets, on shields, on coins, on fasteners, on ritual objects. From Britain and Ireland to Central Europe, it is connected at once with war, with strength, with feasting, and with the sacred. A rare case when one image works in all areas of life simultaneously. Therefore, the boar standard is not a regimental banner. It is a statement about who carries it and in what relations he is with the forces that, according to his belief, decide the outcome of the war. And now the main thing: the carnix and the standard lay together in one buried set. As far as researchers know, there is no second such combination in archaeology. Separately, these things are found on Iron Age sites all over Europe. Together, in one carefully assembled hoard. For the first time, Because of this, the old question returns: why were hoards buried at all? The simple answer is that they hid valuables and could not return. For a part of the finds, it fits. For another part, it sits poorly. Many Iron Age hoards, especially with ritual objects, are considered today not a cache, but a gift. Things were lowered into the ground as an offering to the gods or spirits of the place. In such pits lies the most valuable and most carefully made of what the community had. One does not hide such things from thieves. On the contrary, the very departure of the thing into the earth is the meaning. If the Norfolk hoard is of this category, then the trumpet and the standard were not hidden. They were given away. Iron Age Britain at this time was complex tribal politics, strong craft traditions, and a living connection with the Celtic world across the strait. The tribes of eastern England participated in trade and exchange that stretched to Gaul and further. The things that were made here were not crude copies of continental examples. The Norfolk Carnix confirms this better than any arguments. Now the objects are in restoration, detailed study is underway, full publication is ahead. And the almost intact trumpet, the only one like it on the islands, for the first time allows one to see the instrument entirely, and not by a single surviving mouth. They had known about this city for a long time. They knew the name. They knew who built it. They knew what it did. They did not know one thing: where it is. The location was argued over for centuries. In February, the argument ended. A group under the leadership of Professor Stefan Hauser from the University of Constance, together with British archaeologists Jane Moon, Robert Killick, and Stuart Campbell, confirmed. The ruins at Jebel Khyber in southern Iraq are Alexandria on the Tigris, a port city founded by Alexander the Great in the year 324 before our era. For the world, it was lost for almost 2,000 years. If you arrive there now, you see a flat, scorched plain not far from the Iranian border and a low ridge across it. From the side, a usual fold of the relief, of which there are many. The ridge is the city wall. It stretches for more than 1 kilometer, in places rises almost 8 meters above the plain, and still stands to this day. The city beneath it occupies about 6.5 square kilometers. At the same time, there were no excavations. Not a single stone was moved. Everything that is known about the layout was obtained remotely, shooting from drones, geophysical surveying with a cesium magnetometer, and systematic collection of surface finds. The works covered 500 square kilometers, and from these data a plan emerged. Wide streets laid out in a grid, residential blocks of such a size that, according to the words of Hauser, they surpassed the blocks of Seleucia. And Seleucia was one of the great imperial capitals of the ancient world. Temple precincts, craft districts with traces of kilns and smelting, canals, port basins. An entire city lies immediately beneath the surface and waits. Now, why it was needed at all? When Alexander returned to Mesopotamia from the campaign to the Indus Valley around the year 324 before our era, he saw a problem. The rivers of southern Mesopotamia carry silt, and the old harbors gradually silted up and stopped working. The coastline and riverbeds shifted, and the port facilities could not keep up with them. The solution was this: to found a new city at the point where the Tigris converges with the Karun. Their river transports from all over Mesopotamia went out to the sea routes through the Persian Gulf, and further to the trade networks that stretched to India and to Central Asia. A gateway city, built on purpose at the intersection of the main trade arteries of the ancient world. And for a very long time it worked in this capacity. Later it was called Charax-Spasinu, by the name of the local ruler who rebuilt and expanded the city after a flood. Then Antiochia in Susiana. Under these names, it remained a major political and economic center for more than 550 years. Pliny the Elder mentions it in the 1st century of our era and takes information from even older sources. The city is found in the records of merchants, geographers, and historians all over the ancient world. Not a footnote, one of the nodes of the trade network that connected Rome, Mesopotamia, Persia, and India. The Arsacid Empire, known more as the Parthian Kingdom, held a significant part of the Middle East from approximately the year 250 before our era to the year 226 of our era. For it, this city was a key center of the province, and right here a gap in knowledge opens up. Parthia, for almost the entire time of its existence, was one of the strongest states in the world, an eastern counterweight to Rome, with which it traded, competed, and at times fought. At the same time, it remains one of the least studied great powers of antiquity. The interval between the end of cuneiform and the arrival of Islam, as Hauser himself noted, turned out to be pushed aside. Scientific disciplines developed in such a way that they looked in other directions. Alexandria on the Tigris is the capital of one of the core provinces of Parthia. It is capable of closing a noticeable part of this gap. The end of the city came not from conquerors, from geography. The rivers of southern Mesopotamia change their beds. Silt accumulates. The earth moves slowly. The water goes to the side. By the 3rd century of our era, the Tigris shifted to the west so much that it cut the city off from the main channel. Without this connection, the harbor lost its meaning. River transports fell. The economy weakened. A large part of the inhabitants left. By late antiquity, the city disappeared from the memory of the world. Its trade role was taken by Basra, which since then has remained the main port of the region. The modern history of the find begins in the 60s. British researcher John Huntsman was analyzing aerial photographs of the region taken by the Royal Air Force and noticed regular outlines on the flat terrain near the Iranian border. A large enclosed area, traces of buildings, contours of something significant. Huntsman connected what he saw with ancient descriptions of Alexandria on the Tigris, and on this, everything stalled. The Iran-Iraq War of the 80s made the border strip a military zone. Over a part of the ruins, fortifications were built. The place remained inaccessible for decades. Only in the year 2014 did a British group, under tight guard and with considerable personal risk, gain access and return to what Huntsman had identified from the photographs. On the ground, it was confirmed. The low ridge from the old pictures is indeed the city wall, with a length of more than 1 kilometer, preserved in places. The scale immediately indicated a large city. In the year 2016, Stefan Hauser joined the work and brought into the project geophysics and knowledge of the archaeology of the Middle East of the post-cuneiform time. The years after this, they worked only with non-destructive methods. A part of the north of the country was controlled by a banned group. The situation was difficult. Flights of drones, magnetometric surveys, surface collection, all under armed guard. The result was published and announced in February of the year 2026. Excavations have not begun yet. The geophysical expedition scheduled for this year had to be postponed. Due to military actions against Iran at the beginning of the year 2026, Iraqi airspace was closed. Hauser hopes to return in the autumn of the year 2026, but there is no certainty. What the city will say when it is finally uncovered, no one knows. For now, it is enough that it has been found. The walls stand, the streets lie under the soil, and wait for the day when the earth can be opened. The chamber was opened in January, and the first thing that those who looked inside saw was not a wall and not a sarcophagus. In the middle of the room stood an owl, not a figurine, of which there are many in Zapotec excavations. A large sculpture made carefully and placed in such a way that it is impossible to pass by it. Anyone who enters sees it. The tomb is about 1,400 years old. It is located in the municipality of San Pablo Huitzo in the Mexican state of Oaxaca. Christina Kilgrove wrote about the find in Live Science and Jack Guy on the cable news network, and the conversation about it quickly went far beyond the circle of specialists in Mesoamerica. Around the owl lay human remains and things that are placed only for people of high position, fine ceramics, personal items, offerings to the deceased. To understand why an owl in a tomb means so much, one will have to start from the history of the Zapotecs themselves. This is one of the oldest complex societies of both Americas. The count is usually led from approximately the year 500 before our era, when Monte Alban was founded above the Oaxaca Valley on a leveled mountain peak. They founded it not on a mountain, but in a leveled mountain. The peak was flattened for construction. Monte Alban became one of the first true cities of America, planned, built on a scale that requires both serious power and a large number of people working in coordination. Further, the Zapotecs developed their own writing, one of the earliest in America, their own calendar, detailed knowledge about the movement of celestial bodies. They traded and conducted negotiations, including with Teotihuacan, a gigantic city in the Valley of Mexico, which at its peak, approximately between the years 100 and 500 of our era, was one of the largest cities in the world and set the tone for all of Mesoamerica. The connection went both ways. Ceramics from Oaxaca are found in Teotihuacan, and Teotihuacan influence is visible in the things of the Zapotecs. These were not separate closed societies, but parts of a connected world. The tomb in San Pablo Huitzo is attributed approximately to the year 600 of our era. This is the early classic period of Zapotec history, the 6th and 7th centuries. The time for them is good. Monte Alban operates as a major urban center. The surrounding valleys are densely populated. Art and architecture are at a high level. And judging by the finds throughout the region, it was then that the nobility especially invested in their own funerals. Ruling and priestly families spent money on how their dead are seen off and to which world they are sent. The reason for these expenses is simple. Zapotec religion gave to what happens after death a weight higher than everything else. Veneration of ancestors was at its very core. The deceased remained active and significant participants in the life of the living. Therefore, the tomb of a noble person was not simply a place for the body. It was a thought-out space with a direct religious task to hold the connection of the world of the living with the world of the dead in such a way that the ancestors retained their influence further. Hence the ceramic urns, which almost always stand in such burials. They depict deities or figures of ancestors. And this is not a decoration. This is a working object, a vessel through which the deceased is addressed and the gods are acknowledged. The best examples of this tradition are in Monte Alban itself. The underground tombs of Zapotec rulers there belong to the strongest architecture of pre-Columbian America. Now about the owl. In the cultures of Mesoamerica, the owl is connected with the night, with death, and with the border between the world of the living and what lies beyond it. It is a messenger. It is a guardian. It is a sign of a force that operates in the dark and in the invisible. For the Zapotecs, this connection is even more definite. The owl is connected with the underworld and with the forces that manage death and what is after it. Therefore, an owl of such a size placed in the middle of a burial chamber is not an accident and not a decoration according to the taste of the master. It is a statement about who the person in this room was and in what relations he is with death. Even against the background of well-studied Zapotec funerary art, the find stands out. Rich Zapotec tombs are known for strong objects, but the size and quality of this sculpture point to a person of special position, one whose funeral required investments and skill higher than usual, even for the nobility. Who this was has not yet been established. The remains and things are being studied. They determine age, sex, role in society. The work is not fast, and the results will add much to the find. It is worth saying separately about the place itself. San Pablo Huitzo is not included in the number of the most famous Zapotec sites. It is in the same large region of Oaxaca, which for decades has yielded important finds. But it did not receive such constant attention as Monte Alban and other major centers. And right there, a tomb of similar quality opens up. This is a reminder that the Oaxaca Valley and its surroundings conceal much more. Excavations on the site are going to be expanded, and after the first chamber, they expect a lot from them. What the find has already given is a vivid and well-preserved example of how the nobility was buried in one of the best periods of Zapotec culture, and material for the work that has been going on for a long time. How the Zapotecs used images of death in matters of power and faith. In a society where the border between the living and the dead was not a wall, but a passable threshold, to lie down under an owl meant to declare who you are and where you stand in the general order of things. 252 samples of bottom silt from 41 marine boreholes. No excavation, no trench, no moment when a lantern enters a dark chamber. A laboratory in an English university, samples of mud from the bottom of the North Sea, and a conclusion that rewrote a noticeable chapter of European prehistory. The work was published in March in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States. It was led by Professor Robin Allaby from the University of Warwick. The team included researchers from several institutes, among them Professor Vincent Gaffney from the University of Bradford, one of the main specialists in the world on submerged prehistoric landscapes. They studied Doggerland. This is what they call the landmass that once connected Britain with mainland Europe in the place where the southern part of the North Sea is now. The general outline of this story is known to many. There was land that existed during the last glaciation and after it. It connected the island with the continent until the rising water swallowed it and made a sea out of this place. For almost the entire 20th century, they thought about Doggerland exactly like this: a land bridge, a road along which early people walked back and forth until the water separated them. A useful thing, but not particularly interesting in itself. The new work changes this picture greatly. The method is called ancient sedimentary deoxyribonucleic acid. Instead of digging the bottom or taking out objects, genetic material that was preserved in this silt is extracted from the samples. The samples were taken along the bed of a prehistoric river, which is called the Southern. It flowed through that part of Doggerland that lay further south. The sediments along it accumulated for millennia and retained fragments of the deoxyribonucleic acid of plants and trees that grew along the banks. From these fragments, they reconstructed what the terrain looked like, starting from approximately 16,000 years ago and up to the moment when the land finally disappeared underwater. The reconstructed turned out to be a forest, not a tundra, not a cold, wind-blown plain. A real temperate forest with oak, elm, and hazel, which stood here more than 16,000 years ago. This is thousands of years earlier than trees of this kind appear in British pollen records. They also found linden, a species that needs it warmer. It emerges here approximately 2,000 years earlier than in the mainland British records. And the most unexpected find is Pterocarya, a relative of the walnut. It was believed that it disappeared from northwestern Europe about 400,000 years ago. Its deoxyribonucleic acid lies in the silt. That means the tree survived everything and held out in sheltered corners of this land for a very long time after it was supposed to disappear completely. Why this is important is clearer through an old problem over which they struggled for more than a century. The glaciers began to retreat approximately 20,000 years ago. By all calculations, a forest needs a lot of time to return to the freed land. Trees resettle slowly, seeds fly away for limited distances, and to move a forest hundreds of kilometers to the north is a long business. And fossil data for Britain and Northern Europe show that forests appeared there suspiciously quickly. The problem has a name: Reed's paradox, by the surname of the botanist Clement Reed, who formulated it at the beginning of the 20th century. How did the forest manage in time? Doggerland gives a significant part of the answer. If it stood as a forest already 16,000 years ago, while Britain and the north of the continent were still getting out of glacial conditions, then the forest did not need to go anywhere. The ice retreated, the climate warmed, and the trees were already growing in sheltered river valleys and lowlands. It remained to expand. Such places are called refugia. Their species wait out the harshest time and then spread back out. This is not a minor clarification. This is a direct answer to one of the longest mysteries in the study of European vegetation. Doggerland itself as a concept is known since the beginning of the 20th century. The name came from the Dogger Bank, a shallow area of the North Sea where fishing vessels from time to time pulled out strange things in their nets: mammoth bones, deer antlers. In the year 1931, a trawler raised from the bottom something more interesting: a bone harpoon with barbs. It was attributed to the Maglemosian culture, Middle Stone Age people of Northern Europe, known from approximately 10,300 years ago. The harpoon was named by the name of the vessel that found it, Kalinda. It became one of the main proofs that the now submerged bottom of the North Sea was a home for real human communities. The new work adds depth to this. If 16,000 years ago Doggerland was a wooded land rich in resources, then this is no longer a transit point for migrating people. This is a place where they could live, hunt, and build communities for millennia, until the sea came. The forest fed the boar and the deer. The rivers gave fish. The exact conditions on which Middle Stone Age cultures held throughout all of Northern Europe took shape here earlier than on the present landmass of Britain and Scandinavia. And from here, a direct question to the archaeology of Britain. Early Mesolithic traces on the island are unexpectedly few. If the richest and most comfortable parts of this land for living lay in Doggerland, and Doggerland is now under 60 meters of water, then the evidence of those communities went down together with it. There is one more event in this story. About 8,150 years ago off the shores of Norway, a gigantic underwater landslide occurred and generated a wave known as the Storegga Slide. It was long discussed as the final blow to what remained of Doggerland. The new work says that a part of the land survived even this. Separate sections remained above water still about 7,000 years ago, later than previous estimates assumed. The method of ancient sedimentary deoxyribonucleic acid is now being transferred to other submerged prehistoric landscapes, including to the areas of the Baltic and Black Seas, which in glacial times looked completely different and could also have been populated. What Doggerland showed is that genetic traces in bottom sediments are capable of telling a detailed history of places where it is otherwise impossible to get to at all. This is, in essence, a way to do archaeology without excavations. Questions remained. The northern border of Doggerland is poorly studied, and it is unclear whether there was forest over all the land or the northern sections remained more open and similar to tundra. And direct evidence of the presence of people in Doggerland itself is still very scarce. The reason is simple. The sites are underwater. Without large investments in underwater excavations, and this is expensive and technically difficult, those communities may remain invisible. But the Doggerland from old textbooks, a bare isthmus between two shores, is no longer suitable. It was a living, wooded world right in the center of Northern Europe, and the people who lived in it are only now beginning to receive attention. In ancient Egypt, there existed an unspoken rule: papyrus is not wasted on everything. It cost money. For the majority of people, and in the majority of cases, to take it for daily recording was unrealistic. Therefore, they wrote on something else. Need to jot down a list, note a deal, scribble a letter, or quickly write something down. You take a sherd from a broken pot or a piece of limestone and write on it. Such a fragment is called an ostracon. These were the notepads, receipts, drafts, and short notes of ancient Egypt. They were used constantly and in enormous quantities. And they have a property because of which archaeology loves them. Fired clay and stone do not rot like organic matter. Therefore, incomparably more ostraca have reached us than papyri. In March, the Egyptian publication Al-Ahram reported that a joint expedition of the Supreme Council of Antiquities of Egypt and the University of Tübingen collected at the site of Athribis in the Sohag Governorate about 13,000 inscribed ostraca, 13,000 from one place. This number alone would have been enough for the find to get into the news. But the real weight is given to it not by the quantity, but by what is written on these fragments. First, about the number, so that it becomes clear how unusual it is. A large find of ostraka that is written about in Egyptology usually means hundreds of items. Occasionally, a few thousand. 13,000 from one point, covering more than 1,000 years of the life of the settlement. This is a different order. By the volume of written material, the find stands in the row of the largest from Egypt in recent years. If you read one sherd a day, without days off, it will take more than 35 years. Athribis itself is a place with a long and noticeable history. It stands in the Sohag Governorate in Upper Egypt, and life there was not interrupted throughout many epochs. Temples were built there both under the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after the conquests of Alexander, and later under the Romans and after them. The Tübingen team has been working on this site for several years and has found a lot there. But the 13,000 ostraca are the most significant thing that these excavations have yielded. The value of the archive is first of all in its extent. 1,000 years of texts from one point means that the material captures completely different eras. The late period of Egyptian history, the Greek time, the Roman rule, possibly also the beginning of the Byzantine. For someone who is trying to understand how the Egyptian administration, religious practice, and daily life changed or, on the contrary, did not change with the change of masters of the country, 1,000 years of local records from one city is a rare resource. Usually it is otherwise. The archive is either narrow in time or scattered geographically. Here there is unusual depth in one point over a very long stretch. The content of what has already been analyzed is varied. A noticeable place is occupied by economic documents, accounting, reporting, official records, that without which not a single ancient city worked in any epoch. Next to them are personal letters and ordinary correspondence. And in May, they wrote about Athribis once again. The publication Science Daily reported on texts that attracted special attention. Among the inscriptions, they found rituals against witchcraft and protective formulas. In scientific language, such texts are called phylacteries or apotropaic formulas. In Egypt, they are known, but in the surviving records, they are not found frequently. And they tell about something completely different than temple walls. Not about the official religion of the pharaohs, not about grand theological statements carved in stone, about the private fears and hopes of ordinary people. These are the words that a person sought when he felt a threat from forces that are not visible, when he feared a curse, when he thought that evil witchcraft was directed against him, when illness or misfortune came without an understandable cause. The texts against witchcraft were the answer to this fear. A written protection that can be carried with you, kept at home, or placed in an important place, as insurance against harm. Such material in a noticeable quantity adds to what is known about the folk religion of Egypt, about the faith by which people lived, and not about the ceremonial religion of the state. Temple inscriptions and royal documents tell one version of what the Egyptians believed in. Ostraca with private protective formulas tell another, and in some ways closer. A story about personal anxiety, personal hope, and about threats that seemed real to the person who wrote these words on a piece of a broken pot. The full weight of the archive will not become clear soon. To translate and publish 13,000 texts is work for years, even for a well-provided team. Many ostraca will have to be conserved first before they can even be read at all. And a part may turn out to be such that it will change separate directions of research in an unpredictable way. The Tübingen expedition continues excavations in Athribis, and new finds are expected. Here there is no gold, no royal names, no painted burial chambers. There is volume, there is depth in time, and there are 13,000 pieces of inscribed stone and clay from one Egyptian city over 1,000 years of its life. There is water that destroys, and there is water that preserves. In the flooded caves of Yucatan, the water is cold, dark, and almost without oxygen. Bone holds in it as long as up above. In the hot jungle, it would not have held for even a small fraction. Exactly because of this, the find about which they reported in March exists at all. The Yucatan Peninsula in the southeast of Mexico hides one of the most extensive underwater cave networks of the world. It is called the system of cenotes. Cenotes are natural sinkholes, openings in the limestone rock that go down into a gigantic network of flooded passages. It stretches for hundreds of kilometers under the forest floor. For the ancient Maya who lived above, these openings were sacred. They considered them entrances to Xibalba, the underworld where the gods of death rule. They came to them for centuries with offerings and rituals, but long before the Maya, long before the first temple and the first writing in this part of the world, other people walked through these caves, and they left traces that the water has been protecting since then. In March, a report appeared about a prehistoric human skeleton found inside a flooded part of the system. The burial is about 8,000 years old. This is one of the oldest human burials extracted from the Yucatan network, and it adds a noticeable piece to the picture of the early settlement of the region, which researchers have been assembling for decades. To understand how a person ended up underwater, one needs to know where the water was earlier. During the last glacial epoch and for a few thousand years after it, the sea level all over the world was significantly lower than the current one. A mass of water lay in the ice sheets of the northern hemisphere. In Yucatan, this meant dry caves, not flooded passages where you can get only with equipment, but ordinary caves, dark and cool, but open to anyone who decides to enter. Early inhabitants of the peninsula used them. They took shelter in them. Sometimes they died in them and remained buried there. When the glacial epoch ended and the glaciers melted, the sea level rose for millennia. The water entered the caves from below, flooded the passages, and sealed everything that was there. Bones, tools, and remains of those who visited here ended up in cold, dark water poor in oxygen. And they began to wait. Over the last decades, the Yucatan caves have yielded several finds of the highest level. As divers and researchers began to systematically pass through these passages, the most famous is Naya, an almost complete human skeleton found in the year 2007 in the cave of Hoyo Negro, which means black hole in the east of the peninsula. Naya's age was determined between 12,000 and 13,000 years. This is one of the oldest and most complete human skeletons found in both Americas. Her study complicated the existing picture of how and when the Americas were settled. The shape of the skull and a number of physical traits differed from what is seen in later Native American populations. This raised the question about the relationships between the very first Americans and those who came after. Deoxyribonucleic acid analysis later confirmed that genetically she is related to modern Native Americans, and the differences do not hinder this. But the broader questions that her find posed have not been resolved. The settlement of the Americas is one of the most controversial subjects in all of archaeology. The traditional model says the first Americans crossed from Siberia to Alaska over the land exposed in glacial times and then spread to the south as the ice retreated. Data of the last decades have noticeably complicated this model. There are South American sites that seem to show the presence of people earlier than the permissible term. They propose coastal routes instead of the land corridor or in addition to it. The thought of several separate waves of migration from different source populations receives more and more support. The physical differences in the earliest American skeletons, including Naya, add another layer to this dispute. And there are no signs that the dispute will come to an agreement soon. The new skeleton stands at a different point of this story. 8,000 years ago, this is already the Holocene, after the end of the Ice Age, after the great extinctions of large animals that reshaped the Americas, but still thousands of years before the first Maya settlements in Yucatan. The person whose remains were found lived in a world without agriculture, without cities, and without all that complex structure that later gave the Maya civilization over this same land. These were hunters and gatherers. They walked across a landscape highly unlike the current forest, hunted beasts, gathered plants, and lived in a world that left no written traces. Every skeleton raised from these caves is an individual person who passed through those passages when they were dry, and a source of information about the population that lived here before the known cultures of the region. The deoxyribonucleic acid of the new find is currently being read. The result is awaited with interest. Every ancient genome from this time and these places adds data to where there is still little of it. Depending on what the analysis shows, this person may add something new to the disputes about migration routes, about the kinship of populations, and about the diversity of early Mesoamerican communities. Surveys of the caves continue, and in the distant, less traversed sections of the network, they find new remains and objects. They expect that the caves will yield a lot more before their story will be told entirely. Up above, the jungle grows, and tourists from all over the world travel to the ruins of the great Maya cities. Down below, in the cold and darkness of the flooded passages, they are finding a much earlier history of this peninsula, one careful dive at a time. Almost everything that early people made did not reach us. Wood, bone, plant fiber, leather, rope. Organic matter decays. Out of natural materials, only stone survived, and it survived because it lies for hundreds of thousands of years, where the rest does not lie for even a year. Therefore, the archaeology of early people is built on stone tools, not because stone was the main material, because it is the only one that preserved. We see the past through a filter that lets the hard through and throws away everything else. All the more valuable are the cases when the filter fails. In January, they announced a find at the Marathusa 1 site in the central part of the Peloponnese, in Greece. The research was published in February in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States. It was led by Annemieke Milks, and the team was large and international. It included specialists from the University of Tübingen and Athenian research centers. What they found is the earliest known use of wooden hand tools by anyone of the human genus. The age is about 430,000 years. To understand what this figure means, it is worth trying it on to familiar species. 430,000 years ago, there was neither a person of the modern species nor Neanderthals as separate species. The people who used these tools belong to an earlier circle. Most likely this is Homo heidelbergensis, or a population close to it, the one that is considered the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and us. These were not people like us. And nevertheless, on a Greek slope almost 500,000 years ago, they selected pieces of wood, gave them shape, and worked with them in such a way that the traces of this work can be recognized and dated after hundreds of thousands of years. Before Marathusa, the oldest wooden tools were considered the Schöningen spears. They were taken out in the 90s from a brown coal quarry in the north of Germany. The age is about 300,000 years. This is a throwing and thrusting weapon. The shafts are carefully whittled. The shape is verified by balance. Already then, the find became an event. It clearly showed that the people of that time manufactured thought-out wooden hunting weapons and noticeably pushed back the evidence of working with wood. Marathusa pushes them back by another 100,000 years. The site is not being investigated for the first year, and traces of the activity of ancient people have already been found there. The layers belong to the Middle Pleistocene, a period from approximately 780,000 to 126,000 years ago. But a special sharpness is given to the find by its surroundings. The wooden tools are connected with the butchered remains of a straight-tusked forest elephant. This is one of the largest land animals of Europe of that time. Not a small beast, straight-tusked elephants were larger than current African ones, and their tusks grew longer than 4 meters. To end up next to such an animal and get meat from it is not something that happens casually. Whether the people of Marathusa hunted these elephants or found carcasses and butchered them later, the team has not yet decided. Both options were proposed for similar European sites, and neither is discarded here. But in any case, the presence of wooden tools in such a scene speaks of something important. Whether they worked with them in the hunt itself or during the butchering of the carcass afterward, the use required a plan. To choose a piece of wood, to give it the right shape, to apply it for a specific task. This is not a simple and not an automatic behavior. It requires the ability to imagine the needed thing before you have it, and to go through the steps that will lead to it. Former ideas about the behavior of early people usually did not attribute such an ability to species so ancient. Over the last decades, the science of the thinking of early people has changed noticeably, and it changed all the time in one direction. Find after find pushed back the dates of behavior that was considered much later. Controlled use of fire is recorded at sites older than 400,000 years. Evidence of the application of coloring substances and possible symbolic behavior appears ever earlier. The Schöningen spears showed complex wooden weapons 300,000 years ago. Every such find shifted the picture of human abilities further into the past. Marathusa is the latest and sharpest example of how this series continues. What it changes directly: the time limit from which wood is consciously used as a main material for tools. Previously, the data indicated that developed work with wood becomes established approximately 300,000 years ago. That is, approximately when Neanderthals begin to take shape as a separate group. Marathosa pushes this to a time when the common ancestor of Neanderthals and people of the modern species was still alive, which means that both groups received the ability for such thinking and such manufacture by inheritance and did not develop it each by itself. The consequences of this go also beyond the bounds of the question about Homo heidelbergensis. They concern the deep roots of those skills which then manifested very differently in both Neanderthals and us. And also, this is a reminder of how much of the past we do not see. If wood was used 430,000 years ago, the practice almost certainly began earlier. The evidence in Marathusa survived thanks to a special combination of conditions under which organic matter held out long enough to be found and dated. How many more there were of such moments of working with wood that did not leave a trace cannot be answered in principle. But one can say something else. Every time conditions allow organic matter to survive, a past emerges from the earth richer and more capable than the one drawn by stone inventory alone. Further excavations at Marathusa are planned. The team is assembling a fuller picture of what happened there and how wooden tools fit into the general course of life in this place. The Peloponnese is gradually becoming known as an area rich in finds of the Middle Pleistocene, and Marathusa is the latest in a series of finds from there that have attracted international attention. Greece, as it turns out, has a history of man that goes noticeably deeper than is customarily thought. It was believed that the plague needs a city, crowding, trade, granaries with grain, rats under the floor, a dense settlement where people live on top of each other. Without this set, the disease does not establish itself and does not spread. So the logic looked, and it held for a long time. In June, the publication Science Daily reported on a work that breaks this logic. Researchers analyzed ancient deoxyribonucleic acid from burials of hunter-gatherers in Siberia. They were looking for traces of pathogens of diseases. And they found the plague bacillus in remains with an age of 5,500 years. That is, long before the appearance of the conditions that previous works considered necessary for the spread of plague among humans. To understand why this date is so important, it is useful to see how the plague looks from the human side. It caused the three most destructive epidemic events of written history. The Justinianic plague passed through the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean in the 6th century of our era. It killed millions and shook one of the great powers of that world to its very foundation. The Black Death came to Europe in the year 1347, and over the subsequent years killed approximately a third of the population of the continent. According to various estimates, from 75 to 200 million people died in the world then, one of the most massive events of death in all of human history. Then the third pandemic. It began in the 19th century in China and dispersed around the world along sea routes, carrying away millions more before medicine began to take it under control. The pathogen of all three events was identified and named only in the year 1894. This was done by the Swiss-French bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin, who worked in Hong Kong during the third pandemic. Before this, the cause of the plague was unknown, and the disease went through human history as a destructive and inexplicable force. After Yersin's work, and especially after reading ancient deoxyribonucleic acid became accessible, researchers moved backward through the archaeological record. The task was to understand how old this bacterium is and how long its paths intersect with human ones. Previous works had already pushed its presence in human remains back to the Bronze Age, in separate cases to approximately 5,000 years ago. This, in itself, was a surprise, but it fit into the framework. The Bronze Age, growing cities, expanding trade, increasingly dense settlements. Exactly those conditions that were considered necessary. The Siberian find destroys this framework entirely. 5,500 years ago, the people whose remains were studied did not live in cities. They were not agriculturalists packed into dense villages. These were hunter-gatherers, small groups scattered over Siberian spaces, which moved following the seasons and the beasts upon which they depended. Not a single one of the conditions that were considered mandatory was there. No crowding, no rats, no granaries, no cramped urban communities. But the plague bacillus was. Exactly how the disease walked through such a population and how it looked in these conditions, researchers do not understand yet. The classic picture of plague, the bubonic form, which fleas transfer from infected rats to people living on top of each other in cramped conditions, here most likely does not work. The bacterium could spread by completely different routes and cause a different picture of the disease in people whose life resembled in no way the life of a medieval European city. To figure out the mechanism is one of the main tasks for further works. What the find makes clear is something else. The relationship of man and the plague bacillus is much older and more tangled than written history shows. The three great pandemics that tore apart historical civilizations were not the beginning. These are late chapters of a relationship that took shape thousands of years before at least something was written down, before the appearance of most cities, and before conditions that were considered mandatory for the plague arose anywhere on the planet. From here is a question that is hard to answer, but worth asking. If the plague lived in human groups 5,500 years ago, what did it do to them? About the historical pandemics enough is preserved to estimate the number of dead and to trace the spread. Prehistoric time leaves no such records, but genetic and archaeological data for the Neolithic and early Bronze Age contain signs of sharp collapses of population in different parts of Europe and Asia. Events when the genetic trace of entire regional groups disappears or is replaced by another in a comparatively short time. Disease was named among the possible causes, alongside climate change, migrations, and wars. The new dating of the plague bacillus makes this explanation deserving of a more serious attitude. And researchers are now purposefully looking for traces of the bacterium in burials of those regions and periods where such population failures are already documented. The field of studying ancient pathogens has grown rapidly over the last decade. Reading technologies have improved. The cost has fallen. Ancient remains can now be checked for a wide circle of disease-causing organisms, and they find in this one and the same thing. The dates of the first encounter of man with diseases that were considered comparatively recent go further and further back. The plague bacillus is the sharpest example for today, but most likely not the last. The work was the most ordinary, the clearing of the courtyard at a tomb that they had known for a long time. It belonged to a man by the name of Seneb, and in this courtyard, Egyptian archaeologists stumbled upon an entrance to a rectangular room carved right into the rock. What turned out to be inside stopped the work. The matter was on the west bank of the Nile in Luxor, in the area of Kurna. This is a part of the Asasif necropolis, which stretches along the slope opposite the temples of Karnak. The Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities of Egypt announced the find at the end of February. Working was a joint expedition of the Supreme Council of Antiquities and the Zahi Hawass Foundation for Archaeology and Heritage. In the chamber stood 22 painted wooden coffins. They were stacked in 10 horizontal rows. The lids were separated from the boxes to fit as many as possible. The one who carried them here laid the cargo attentively and economically. In the majority of the coffins, mummies remained. And this detail means more than it seems at first glance. The time to which the burials belong was hard for Egypt. A multitude of noble burials of this epoch were opened, cleaned out, or transferred in antiquity. To enter a chamber where the mummies are in place is not something one can count on in advance. Next to the coffins, they found vessels that were used in embalming and a large ceramic jug, and in it, 8 scrolls of papyrus of different sizes. On some of the scrolls, the original clay seals were preserved. This means that what is written inside, nobody read from the day they were put there and sealed. Between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. The field director of the excavations, Afifi Rohim, called them a treasure of information. What is written there they will learn only after restoration and translation, and this will take time. Expectations around these scrolls are large. The coffins themselves have a peculiarity for the sake of which it is worth stopping. On the majority, there are no personal names. Instead of a name, a position. And the position repeating in this chamber again and again sounds like this: Singer of Amun. Sometimes it is translated otherwise: Performer of Hymns of Amun. To understand what this means, one needs to know a little the world in which these women lived. The burials are attributed to the Third Intermediate Period of Egyptian history, approximately from the year 1077 to 664 before our era. These are the dynasties from the 21st to the 25th. It ensued after the New Kingdom, after the time of Ramesses the Great. And this was an epoch when central power in Egypt disintegrated. The country split between rival centers. The ruling circle sat in Tanis in the north. Another pillar of power was in Thebes in the south. A unified Egypt which the great pharaohs built no longer existed, at least at that moment. But one thing in Thebes went through all this without losses. The cult of Amun, based on the great temple complex of Karnak, held power over Upper Egypt throughout the entire period. The high priests of Amun were not just religious figures. They had real political strength, and at times they practically ruled the whole region independently. Karnak, too, was not just a place of worship. It was a large landowner, an employer for an enormous number of people, an economic force, and the center of the most important ceremonies of southern Egypt. Inside such a world, the singers of Amun occupied a place far more weighty than one could suppose by the name of the position. These were women of high position, usually from priestly families or from the most respected families of Thebes. They participated in temple rituals directly. They played the sistrum, a variety of rattle connected with the goddess Hathor, and on the menat, a heavy necklace of beads which was rhythmically shaken during the ritual. Temple music in ancient Egypt was not background or decoration. It was understood as a direct way to speak with the gods, to hold their favor and maintain that order upon which all Egyptian religion stood. The women who performed this music were a working part of the temple and not an appendix to it. Their position is visible by how they were remembered. The singers of Amun are found in tomb paintings, in inscriptions, in economic documents, both in the New Kingdom and later. They originated from influential families and bore their title with pride. It was carved on coffins and burial objects as one of the main things that was worth saying about a person after death. And since on the coffins from Kurna titles stand and not names, it means, in a burial sense, what these women were engaged in was more important than who each of them was individually. The chamber itself is almost certainly secondary. That is, the coffins were brought here from another place and not placed during the first funerals. They did this in the Third Intermediate Period constantly, and the reason is known. The necropolis of Thebes in those years was robbed seriously. Royal burials that had stood for centuries were opened and stripped. The priests who answered for the necropolis began to collect vulnerable dead people and transfer them to safer places. The most famous example of such work is the cache in Deir el-Bahari, found in the year 1881. In it ended up the mummies of dozens of pharaohs of the New Kingdom, which the priests quietly collected and hid anew centuries after the first funerals. The chamber in Kurna looks like the exact same operation, only conducted not for kings, but for a group of temple women. The reason is the same: to protect the dead while the usual order does not work. The tombs from where these coffins were brought have not yet been found. Excavations around the chamber continue exactly for the sake of this, and the finding of the original burials will add much to the history of these women. But the main unknown for now is in the jug. 8 scrolls sealed and unread for up to 3,000 years, found in a room full of the dead. There could be funerary texts written exactly for these women. There could be hymns to Amun, of those that were performed in Karnak. There could be economic records. Or there could turn out to be something that no one expects. Egyptian papyri have a long history of the appearance of material that changed ideas about its epoch. Until the restoration is finished and the texts cannot be read, this is one of the most interesting things in Egyptology waiting for discovery. In the year 1978, workers were digging in the center of Mexico City and broke through into a void. From the earth emerged a massive carved stone disc with a depiction of the dismembered body of the lunar goddess Coyolxauhqui. With this began one of the longest urban excavations in the world. It has not stopped since then and issues major finds to this day. At the end of February, another one arrived from there. The publication Heritage Daily reported on a significant find in the Templo Mayor, a large ceremonial pyramid that stood in the heart of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs. They excavated 3 stone boxes. Inside is a collection of objects that is worth analyzing in parts. More than 80 figurines of green stone in the Mezcala style, and about 4,000 samples of marine origin, corals, shells, and other material from the sea. All this lay together. Researchers identified the find as a single, intentionally made ritual offering. The offering is associated with the time of the rule of Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, known as Moctezuma I, who ruled the Aztec Empire approximately from the year 1440 to 1469. To understand the weight of the find, one needs to understand what the Templo Mayor was and what it meant for those who built it. Tenochtitlan was founded in the year 1325 on a small island in the middle of Lake Texcoco in the high valley of central Mexico. Over the next 2 centuries, by military conquests, alliances, and pure organizational strength, the Aztecs turned this island settlement into one of the largest cities in the world. By the arrival of the Spanish detachments in the year 1519, from 200,000 to 300,000 people lived in Tenochtitlan, more than in any European city of that time. The lake around was altered: dams, aqueducts, artificial islands. By any standards, this was outstanding work in planning and construction. In the physical and semantic center of all this stood the Templo Mayor. The temple represented a double pyramid with 2 shrines at the top, each dedicated to its own deity. The southern shrine belonged to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, the patron of the Aztec people, that divine force to which the empire attributed its military successes. The northern one was dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility of the earth, upon whose mercy it depended whether the crops would grow and whether there would be enough food. Together, the 2 shrines represented the 2 pillars of the Aztec state: war and sustenance, conquest and bread. And the temple itself was the embodiment of this balance in the very center of the city. The temple was repeatedly rebuilt. Every major ruler added a new external shell on top of the old building, making it higher and more imposing, as a statement of his rule. Therefore, archaeologists at this site go by layers, one after another, and every layer is tied to a specific ruler and a specific time of Aztec history. The 3 stone boxes refer to the construction phase of Moctezuma I, one of the most significant figures of the early history of the empire. Under him, the Aztec army actively marched through central Mexico. New lands passed under the power of Tenochtitlan. And that system of tribute was formed upon which the empire lived afterward for decades. He also seriously expanded the Templo Mayor itself. The found offering refers to this period of growth and claims. The content of the 3 boxes tells a story in 2 layers. The marine part is simpler for understanding. Corals, shells, and other material from the sea are found in many offerings found in the Templo Mayor over the years of work, and their meaning in Aztec concepts is analyzed not badly. The ocean signified the border of the known world, the place where creation began, and from where came the forces of fertility and abundance. To bring material from the sea to the center of the city and place it inside the most sacred building of the empire meant to pull this force to oneself, to connect the capital with the edges of the world. 4,000 marine samples in one offering is a very substantial investment in this idea, and an indication of a ritual planned at the very top. The figurines are more interesting and, in a certain sense, more eloquent. The Mezcala culture existed on the territory of the current state of Guerrero in the southwest of Mexico. By time, somewhere between 2,000 and 500 years before the Aztec epoch. Its masters made stone figurines of a recognizable style, abstract human forms, simplified facial features, green stone worked with real skill. By the time the Aztecs were building their empire, the Mezcala culture had not existed for several centuries. That is, these were not contemporary things to the Aztecs. This was antiquity from a world that had long disappeared, and the Aztecs purposefully sought out this antiquity. The habit of collecting old objects of alien cultures and placing them as sacred offerings inside the Templo Mayor is documented at a multitude of stages of the excavations of this site. Figures of the Olmecs, objects connected with Teotihuacan, material of civilizations that rose and fell long before the appearance of the Aztec state. All this is found in the sacrificial layers under the temple. Researchers for years have been figuring out what this habit says about Aztec thinking. The most accepted explanation is this. Ancient objects were considered receptacles of accumulated sacred force, which accumulated over centuries while these things were used and venerated by the cultures that created them. To collect such objects across all of Mesoamerica and place them into the core of one's own religious practice meant to take this force for oneself. To tie the empire with the deep history of the region and present Tenochtitlan as the legitimate heir of everything that was in the ancient world before it. More than 80 Mezcala figurines in one place, connected directly with Moctezuma I, is the largest accumulation of such material found in a single context in the Templo Mayor. Behind this stands something organized and intentional at the level of the imperial court, a ritual for which it was necessary to find, collect, and bring a significant assembly of ancient objects and then lay them together with thousands of marine samples inside the most sacred building of the empire. What message to the gods was sent by this, we do not know. It is only known that in Tenochtitlan they considered it important enough to go for serious trouble for the sake of it. The layers of the temple with which they are working to this day contain offerings of different reigns, and in the expedition they expect that significant contributions still lie under the surface. The marine samples from the last find are now being studied to determine from where exactly in the ancient world they originate. This will help to see more clearly where Aztec trade and the network of tribute reached at the peak of the empire's power. From the outside, the tropical forest looks like a pantry. Greenery to the horizon, life in every tier, water nearby. Indeed, for a person without preparation, this is one of the most uncomfortable places on the planet. Little light reaches the ground under the canopy. The greater part of the plants that grow below is inedible without serious processing. It is harder to track down and obtain large animals in the thick greenery than in an open place. From this, a conviction took shape, which held in science for decades. It was considered thus: early people moved along open places, grass plains, savannas, coasts. They gave food, visibility, and relatively easy movement, and worked as natural roads. A dense tropical forest was bypassed and not passed straight through. It was also considered that without modern tools and accumulated knowledge, one cannot survive in a forest for a long time, and that the large forest belts of Central and West Africa were an obstacle for early man and not a place where one builds a life. In May, the publication Science Daily reported on a work that turns this picture over. The research found evidence that ancient people lived in a dense rainforest of West Africa much earlier than science considered possible. On paper, this looks like a clarification of a date. In essence, the cancellation of an assumption upon which the ideas about the dispersal of man had been built for decades. The first cracks in this picture appeared earlier and not in Africa. Over the last decade, data have accumulated about the early presence of people in the rainforests of South and Southeast Asia. Sites in Sri Lanka and on Borneo, among others, pushed back the dates of living in forest conditions of these regions by tens of thousands of years. But every time the finds were simply integrated into the general picture without touching its basis. Partly because Africa itself had not yet yielded such evidence. The West African data changed this. The found things show people who lived and were adapted to the conditions of a dense rainforest significantly earlier than the accepted chronology allowed. And this happens in an area lying in the heart of one of the oldest and most complex forest environments of the planet. The rainforests of West Africa cover a large part of the region and in the east merge with the vast Congo Basin. These are some of the richest forest systems of the Earth. They have stood as a forest extremely long, which means for as much time they were a possible habitat for man. The question was only in whether they made use of it. The answer turned out to be affirmative, and earlier than anyone expected. West Africa has also a genetic side, because of which the find hits especially accurately. The populations living there today carry some of the most deeply diverging branches of the whole human family tree. Their ancestral lineages separated from the rest very early in our evolutionary history. The genetic diversity of West Africa is exceptionally great, and it reflects a very long and basically continuous presence of man in these places throughout many millennia. At the same time, the archaeological record of early man in West Africa was always noticeably thinner than in Eastern. The main part of ideas about the early behavior and abilities of man was given by such places as Blombos Cave in South Africa and a whole series of East African sites. Partly the gap reflects real differences in preservation, but a noticeable part of it reflects something else: exactly where research was conducted and how hard it is to work in the tropics, where preservation is usually poor, and with access and financing it is not always simple. The mismatch between what genetics says about the long settlement of West Africa and what archaeology was able to show was a known problem in this field for many years. If people lived in West African forests earlier than was believed, a part of this gap is explained. Evidence of habitation in a forest environment is harder to find and preserve than in open places. Tools, bones, and other remains destroy faster in the humid heat of the forest floor. Sites get overgrown by dense vegetation and thick layers of foliage, the conditions that make a rainforest so productive for its animals and plants. These are exactly the conditions that over millennia eat up archaeological traces. From this follows an important thing. The absence of finds in such an environment always required careful handling. And the new find is a clear example why. What it adds to the overall picture of the abilities of early man is one more piece of evidence of how flexible and adapting a person of the modern species was from the early times of his history. To enter a dense rainforest and figure out how to live in it is not a simple task. It requires real and detailed knowledge of the local environment. What is safe to eat? How to move through dense vegetation? Where to get clean water? How to read a terrain that gives almost no distant visibility? Such knowledge is accumulated by generations of life in one place and transmitted inside a community further. The people whose presence is documented in these West African forests did not pass by. They lived there and lived successfully enough to leave a trace that survived to our days. The consequences go far beyond the bounds of West Africa. If early people lived in a dense tropical forest of this region earlier than supposed, the question of where else they could do the exact same becomes significantly more open. The equatorial forest belt stretches through large parts of Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and South America. And there are considerable sections of all these areas where an early presence of man was not seriously looked for, partly exactly because the old assumption made it improbable. Now this assumption looks much weaker. It is expected that the find will be followed by new surveys in other equatorial forest zones. The West African results give researchers a reason to look more attentively at an environment which previously they bypassed. Excavations at West African sites continue, and as the work goes on, they await new evidence of early settlement of forest places. The story about where early people lived and to what they were able to adapt continues to expand. And this is one of the most illustrative examples of a find that pushes it apart to a side for which no one was ready. For more than a century, researchers have been arguing why the Neanderthals disappeared. Over this time, a long list of explanations has accumulated, and not a single one of them has converged with the data entirely. In February, a work came out that approached the question from a side from which it had not been approached before, and the answer to which it came is not the one that the majority expects. The research was published in the journal Quaternary Science Reviews. It was led by Professor Ariane Burke from the University of Montreal, head of the research group on the dispersal of ancient humans. The team took a method from a completely different field, from conservation biology. There is a worked-out tool there, modeling how populations of animals and plants survive or perish when their habitat is fragmented into pieces. This approach was applied to archaeological and climatic data of one segment of time, the so-called marine isotope stage 3, approximately from 60,000 to 35,000 years ago. This is exactly that window when Neanderthals and people of the modern species shared Europe, and when the time of the Neanderthals was running out. Before passing to what the model showed, it is worth stopping for a minute and realizing how long the Neanderthals existed at all. They lived in Europe and Western Asia about 300,000 years. During this time, they went through more than one glaciation and climatic swings far sharper than those that caught the period of their disappearance. This was not a fragile or primitive species. Researchers of the last decades sequentially rewrote the old image of the Neanderthal as a simple savage. It became clear that they manufactured complex tools. They used adhesive substances to attach parts of tools to handles. They applied coloring substances to the body or to objects, and they manifested behavior that is very similar to symbolic. They buried their dead. They cared for the wounded. And when people of the modern species came to Europe, the two groups did not disperse to different corners. Genetic data show they met, spent time together, and in separate cases had common children. People outside of Africa carry from 1 to 4% of Neanderthal deoxyribonucleic acid, a direct consequence of those encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. And so a species that held out for 300,000 years was technically skilled, socially complex, and actively mixed with arriving people of the modern species simply disappears from the fossil record about 40,000 years ago. The usual explanations upon attentive analysis do not hold. The thought that people of the modern species exterminated the Neanderthals does not converge either with the chronology or with the numbers of those and the others. A pure climatic blow also does not work. Neanderthals passed through far worse climatic conditions and did not disappear. Diseases brought by people of the modern species are theoretically possible, but to check this on available data is extremely difficult. And not a single one of these single-cause explanations takes into account the main thing. The disappearance went differently in different parts of Europe. Different timelines, different sequences of events, different pressures depending on which area one looks into. Something more complex was happening, and specialists understood this long ago. Here, Burke's approach turns out to be useful. Instead of the question, what force or what event destroyed the Neanderthals, the research asked a question of structure. How did the terrain look for them in this period? How was the habitat suitable for them distributed across Europe? How well did its best sections connect with each other? And how did all this look at the exact same time for people of the modern species? The results turned out to be sharp. Areas that yielded good living conditions for people of the modern species were well connected with each other all over Europe. They folded into a wide and sufficiently integral network from west to east. Areas suitable for Neanderthals were fragmented, especially between Western and Eastern Europe. There lay substantial gaps both in the quality of the environment and in its connectedness. In translation to practice, the difference turns out to be serious. When a group of people of the modern species received a blow, a severe winter, an outbreak of disease, a string of unsuccessful hunts, nearby, within reach, most likely there were other groups capable of helping. New people came from connected communities and brought with them fresh genetic diversity, new knowledge, and additional hands. The network absorbed the blow and the group recovered. When the exact same thing happened with a Neanderthal group, especially in Eastern Europe, where the fragmentation of the environment was strongest of all, nearby there might simply turn out to be no one. The group shrank, lost genetic diversity generation after generation, gradually weakened, and there was nothing for it to replenish itself with. No separate catastrophe was required for the end. Isolation and slowly accumulating pressure were enough by themselves, given a sufficiently long term. In Western Europe, the picture was different. There, the habitats of the two groups overlap directly, which means people of the modern species could play a more active role in displacing the local Neanderthal populations. Through direct competition for the exact same resources on the exact same land, for food, for shelters, for territory. Two species fought for one and the same thing in one and the same places. And people of the modern species, with their better connected networks and larger effective numbers, had an advantage. In Eastern Europe, everything went otherwise. The growing isolation of Neanderthal groups led not to direct displacement, but to something slower, to a gradual dissolving into the gene pool of people of the modern species through mixing that continued for many generations. This process explains immediately two things: both the presence of Neanderthal deoxyribonucleic acid in modern people outside of Africa, and the disappearance of genetically distinct Neanderthal communities in these areas, without any dramatic clash. Taken as a whole, the research describes not a single event of extinction with one cause. This is a slow process, different in different areas, a patchwork quilt of different circumstances that formed in different places over millennia and led to one and the same outcome, but by different paths. Climatic instability made a contribution. Direct competition made a contribution. Genetic dissolving made a contribution. Isolation made a contribution. But how much of all this a specific Neanderthal population could withstand was determined first of all by one thing: by how well it was connected with other groups of its species. Those who were part of a working network had options. Those who ended up isolated had no options. This is a noticeable shift in the very posing of the question. The dispute about the extinction of the Neanderthals historically revolved around external forces: what hit them, what came from outside, and turned out to be unbearable. Burke's work turns the question around and looks at the internal structure of Neanderthal society, and at the extent to which this structure, through no one's specific fault, left them defenseless when several types of pressure arrived simultaneously. People of the modern species, with their wider and better connected network stretched across the continent, simply ended up in a better position to absorb those exact same blows and again recover. The matter is not necessarily that they were smarter, stronger, or more persistent. They were more connected. And over a long distance, this is what decided. The approach to modeling developed by the team is already being applied to other questions about early movements and dispersal of humans. They look at how different populations responded to changes in the environment over much longer stretches of time. In parallel, work is going on with ancient deoxyribonucleic acid regarding the structure of Neanderthal populations. It is expected that it will clarify the picture of connectedness even more strongly as reading technologies improve and available Neanderthal genomes become more numerous. Questions remain. First of all, about whether direct violence between the two species played a substantial role in specific areas at a specific time. The model cannot answer this, and physical data by themselves could never resolve this question. But for today, this work gives the most complete picture of why a species that held out in Europe 300,000 years could not pass through exactly this segment of time. They were finished off not by one thing. They were finished off by the weight of several pressures laid upon populations which, because of where they lived and how their world was structured, had less space than their neighbors to withstand even something of this. Now about the promise from the beginning. For 100 years, this question was answered identically. They looked for what crashed down on the Neanderthals from the outside. The answer turned out to be in another place, in how far it is to a neighbor and whether it is possible to reach him. The 12 stories of this year rest on one common property. Almost everything in them survived by chance. The wood survived to us because it ended up in an environment where organic matter does not decay. The bones in the Yucatan caves, because they were flooded with cold water without oxygen. The records from the Egyptian town, because poor people wrote on broken dishes and not on papyrus. The forest at the bottom of the North Sea reached us in the form of fragments of deoxyribonucleic acid in silt. Alexander's city stood under the soil for 2,000 years because the river went away and no one started building on top. And that which did not end up in such conditions disappeared entirely, and it is not in the list. The year at the same time is not finished. Excavations in the south of Iraq are waiting for an open sky. 13,000 sherds are waiting in line for reading. Deoxyribonucleic acid from the Yucatan cave is being read right now, and 8 scrolls with intact seals as before lie unrolled. Write in the comments everything that you think about the finds of this year, and subscribe to the Top Facts channel on the selection of the most incredible facts and videos from all over the internet. Thank you all very much for viewing, and right now watch our previous incredible episodes that have already appeared on your screen.